The world is quietly but profoundly transforming. Beneath the surface of daily headlines and routine news, a deeper shift is underway, one that is changing the very fabric of global power and influence. For decades, the United States stood as the undisputed leader, both economically and militarily. The dollar reigned supreme as the world's reserve currency, and Middle Eastern oil kept the engines of global industry running. American influence shaped international institutions, set the rules of trade, and projected military might across continents. But as we approach the end of 2025, these once solid foundations are beginning to crack. Economic uncertainty, shifting energy demands, and political polarization are eroding the pillars that supported U.S. dominance. The world is no longer content to follow a single leader. New powers are rising on the global stage. Alliances are shifting in unexpected ways, and the rules that governed the last century are being rewritten before our eyes. Countries that were once considered peripheral are now central players in shaping the future. This isn't a sudden upheaval, but a steady, relentless drift, one that can be felt in the bustling streets of Beijing, the corridors of power in Moscow, and the rapidly modernizing skylines of Riyadh. These cities are becoming new centers of gravity in a changing world. Former rivals are now finding common ground, forging partnerships that would have seemed impossible just a decade ago. Meanwhile, old allies are beginning to question their commitments, unsure of where their interests truly lie in this new landscape. The central story of our time is the redistribution of power. We are witnessing a transition from a world dominated by a single superpower to a far more complex, multipolar system. Influence is now shared, negotiated, and sometimes contested by a diverse group of nations. At the heart of this seismic shift is energy, specifically oil. Control over energy resources has always been a key driver of geopolitical power, and today it remains the linchpin of global strategy. Now, a new bloc, led by Russia, China, and Saudi Arabia, is leveraging its control over oil to reshape the global financial system. By coordinating their strategies, these nations are challenging the dominance of the dollar and seeking to create alternative centers of economic gravity. This is about more than just economics. It's a direct and unprecedented challenge to American dominance. The very structure of global power is being contested, with far-reaching implications for every nation. The consequences of this shift will touch everyone, affecting everything from the price you pay at the gas pump, to the stability of your job, to the security of your nation's economy. No one is immune to these changes. Ultimately, the world our children inherit will be shaped by the choices and alliances being made today. The next generation will grow up in a world that looks very different from the one we knew. The Russia-China-Saudi Arabia axis isn't just a topic for foreign policy experts. It represents a fundamental reordering of the world's balance of power. Their cooperation signals a new era, one that will redefine global alliances and rivalries. The effects of these changes will echo for decades to come, making the future far less certain and far more dynamic than the past. The shifting sands of global power are reshaping our world, and the story is only just beginning. For over 50 years, the petrodollar system has been the backbone of global finance, making the US dollar the world's dominant reserve currency. This arrangement began in the 1970s, when oil-producing nations agreed to price and sell their oil exclusively in dollars, in exchange for security guarantees and economic cooperation from the United States. As a result, countries around the world needed dollars to buy oil, creating massive and sustained global demand for the greenback. This not only cemented American economic power but also allowed the U.S. to borrow cheaply and run persistent trade deficits, fueling decades of prosperity and influence. Now, however, the landscape is shifting. Russia, China, and Saudi Arabia, three of the world's largest energy players, are working together to create an alternative to the petrodollar system. These countries are increasingly conducting energy trade in other currencies, especially the Chinese yuan, but also the Russian ruble and even the Saudi rial. This move is designed to reduce their dependence on the US dollar and insulate themselves from Western financial pressure. For Russia, finding new markets outside Western sanctions is a matter of economic survival and geopolitical strategy. China, on the other hand, wants the yuan to reflect its growing economic might and to play a much larger role in global trade and finance. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia is seeking new partnerships and greater flexibility as it looks to diversify its alliances and reduce its reliance on the West. This isn't a formal alliance, but rather a strategic partnership, an evolving collaboration aimed at creating a more multipolar world where no single currency or country dominates. When these three nations coordinate their energy policies and financial systems, they can bypass Western-controlled financial networks and directly challenge the supremacy of the petrodollar. If the petrodollar system unravels, global demand for dollars could fall sharply, weakening its value and raising borrowing costs in the US. This could have far-reaching consequences for the American economy and its global standing. For other countries, however, this shift means more choices, greater independence, and less vulnerability to US sanctions or financial pressure. Ultimately, this is a fundamental power play, an ambitious attempt to de-Americanize the global economy, one oil barrel at a time, and to reshape the rules of international finance. The world's financial architecture is being rewritten before our eyes, and the end of the petrodollar era could mark the beginning of a new chapter in global economic history. Russia has long used energy as a tool of statecraft. Cut off from Western markets, Russia has pivoted to China, signing massive energy deals and building pipelines like the Power of Siberia. These deals are increasingly settled in rubles and yuan, insulating both countries from US sanctions and boosting the yuan's global role. Russia also partners with Saudi Arabia through OPEC+, coordinating oil production and influencing prices. This cooperation signals to Washington that Saudi Arabia has alternatives. By leveraging energy, Russia is building a new economic bloc and undermining the US-led order. For Moscow, this is about more than survival. It's a bid to reclaim global power. Saudi Arabia's old bargain, oil for US security, is fading. Under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the kingdom is diversifying its alliances, especially with China and Russia. Saudi Arabia has signed broad agreements with China and openly discussed accepting yuan for oil. Its partnership with Russia in OPEC+ gives both countries leverage over oil prices, sometimes at odds with US interests. Riyadh now acts with newfound independence, balancing relationships to maximize its influence. The kingdom isn't abandoning the US, but it's no longer relying solely on Washington. By building ties with China and Russia, Saudi Arabia is securing its future in a multipolar world. This pragmatic shift reflects a changing global landscape. The US faces an unfamiliar challenge as its financial dominance is threatened. The dollar's reserve status has underpinned American power, but the Russia-China-Saudi axis is eroding this privilege. Washington can respond with confrontation, sanctions, pressure, and diplomacy, but risks accelerating the shift away from the dollar. Alternatively, the US could adapt, focusing on economic strength, innovation, and flexibility in a multi-currency world. This would mean accepting a role as first among equals, rather than sole superpower. The erosion of the petrodollar is more than financial. It's a symptom of shifting global power. America's response will define its place in the 21st century. Will it cling to old dominance or adapt to a new shared landscape? The era of automatic supremacy is ending. A more complex era has begun. The recent moves by Russia, China, and Saudi Arabia aren't just headlines. They have real, tangible effects on everyday life, reaching far beyond the world of politics and high finance. When major oil producers coordinate to cut supply, oil prices climb. This doesn't just mean a pricier commute or higher heating bills, it also raises the cost of transporting goods, which can make everything from groceries to online orders more expensive. If China starts paying for oil in yuan instead of dollars, global demand for the yuan increases, while the dollar's dominance weakens. This shift could change how currencies are valued and traded worldwide. A weaker dollar means Americans pay more for goods and services abroad, and imported products at home become pricier. Everyday essentials from electronics to food could see price hikes. If central banks around the world start holding fewer dollars, US interest rates could rise. This would make loans for homes, cars, and businesses more expensive, potentially slowing economic growth and affecting job opportunities. For developing nations with large dollar debts, a weaker dollar can ease repayment burdens. But sudden shifts in currency values or oil prices can also trigger financial crises, especially in vulnerable economies. The transition away from a dollar-centric system could bring new volatility to global finance, with unpredictable swings in markets and currencies. Every change in oil trading ripples through the world economy, affecting everything from the cost of shipping goods to the price of your morning coffee, or the food on your table. The interconnectedness of modern markets means that no country, business, or individual is truly immune from these shifts. What happens in one part of the world can quickly impact lives everywhere. The stakes are deeply personal, not just political. These global changes shape the prices you pay, the jobs available, and the security of your family's future. Every nation in this realignment faces risks and rewards. Russia seeks economic sovereignty by de-dollarizing, but risks dependence on China. China aims to elevate the yuan and its global status, but its financial system isn't fully ready, risking instability or confrontation. Saudi Arabia wants strategic autonomy, balancing East and West for maximum leverage. But moving too close to China and Russia could alienate the US and jeopardize its security. The US risks a slow decline if it's passive or backlash if it overreacts. The reward for adaptation is guiding the world's transition to a stable multipolar system. Each country walks a tightrope. One misstep could have lasting global consequences. The stakes are high and the margin for error is slim. The world is watching how these powers navigate the new order. The outcome will shape the century. We're at the dawn of a new, uncertain era. The post-Cold War order, defined by US dominance and the dollar, is ending. Russia, China, and Saudi Arabia are driving a fundamental restructuring of global power. The future will be fragmented with multiple centers of influence and competing currencies. What happens next depends on the choices these nations make. Will Saudi Arabia sell oil in yuan? How will the US respond? The transition could bring instability, currency swings, and economic uncertainty for billions. The story of the Petrodollar's challenge is the story of the 21st century taking shape. Understanding these forces is the first step to preparing for the unpredictable world ahead.